Dr. John Torres from NBC News on his Facebook Live. I want to cover a couple headlines of coronavirus, things you've probably heard over this past week, but I also want to answer questions you have. So please forward your questions while I'm talking here. We'll get to as many of those as we can. But first, a few of the headlines. You might have heard over the past few days, and particularly over this last week, about airborne transmission of coronavirus. And the World Health Organization just came out with a statement saying that it is possible in very specific situations. The reason this is happening, and to kind of take you through the timeline, is since we first heard about coronavirus in the pandemic, we've been talking about respiratory droplets. Now, to get kind of down in the science level, respiratory droplets are droplets that are 5 microns or bigger in size. And the reason that's important is because if they are bigger in size like that, especially if they're accompanied with mucus or other things that we might be expelling when we cough or sneeze, those are heavy. And so they drop to the ground very, very quickly. And that's why we talk about that 6-foot distance, because typically they go 3, maybe 5 feet. And so 6 feet keeps you out of that range. The question is, does it have airborne transmission? And what that means is that instead of the respiratory transmission, the respiratory droplets, airborne transmission, those droplets are smaller. They're under 5 microns. Often they're under 1 micron. They're extremely, extremely small. The perfect example is measles. Measles is spread by airborne transmission. It's a very small virus particle. It can linger in the air for hours. And that's important because you can imagine if something drops to the ground very quickly, it's a little harder to spread versus something that lingers in the air. And that's why measles is so very contagious. And it's what we usually talk about when we talk about the virus that's most contagious. Measles falls into that group. This virus is not as contagious as measles, but it seems to be more contagious than the flu. So the confusion's been, is it respiratory? Is it aerosolized? Where do we land in that spectrum? Most scientists up until now have been saying it's more respiratory droplets, but a group of scientists actually wrote a letter to the World Health Organization saying, hey, you need to come out with a statement talking about the possibility of aerosolized transmission, of airborne transmission. The reason they're doing this is because there was a study in China in a restaurant where one patron had coronavirus and it ended up spreading to other tables even though they were social distancing. They think that happened because of the air conditioning system and the way the air ventilation worked and the possibility that there is some aspect of this aerosolized, this airborne transmission. So the World Health Organization has looked into it. CDC has looked into it. What the WHO now says is that it looks like in some situations there could be a component of airborne transmission, but it's not the most likely way this is going to spread. This is going to spread through respiratory droplets, and that's why that 6-foot distance is so important. And they're saying that in certain situations, though, indoors, particularly with ventilation systems that are set up to be able to spread it through their airflow, then that's where it gets concerned with this airborne, this aerosolized transmission. And that's also why I think we're seeing less cases outdoors than we're seeing indoors, because again, it seems to be spreading more that way indoors. And it makes sense. If you have a lot of people grouped inside and there is even a component of the aerosolized transmission, it can hang in the air longer than the droplets that drop to the ground quickly. Air conditioning can move that around and it can go further than that 6-foot distance. That's why we're also saying if you have something going on and you can't necessarily social distance, the more you can put that outside, the better. Whether you can social distance or not, having it outside is an improvement over having it inside as far as why people are getting it and why people aren't getting it. Perfect example there are the protests. Not many people have actually gotten it because of the protests, at least they don't think they have. Time will tell, we're still looking into that, but they think that's because it was outside and it dilutes more of the virus outside than it does indoors. So that's the one about airborne transmission. The second headline is talking about remdessevir. Up until now, we have talked about dexamethasone, a steroid, as being the only drug that has shown any life-saving benefits. And what they found is when they put critically ill or severely ill patients on dexamethasone, particularly those that needed oxygen or on ventilators, that some of them actually improved and avoided dying. And so it actually cut their chances of dying from coronavirus. Up until now, that's been the only one. Well, Gilead Sciences, who makes remdesivir, just came out with some results from their findings that it seems that remdesivir, in their findings, reduced the risk of death by 62% in severely ill patients. Difference here being remdesivir is an antiviral. So that's a medicine that actually is attacking the virus and not letting the virus take hold in the body or getting rid of it. Dexamethasone is a steroid. What that does is that reduces that cytokine storm, that immune response, that inflammatory response that causes issues later on, particularly shock symptoms and organ failure. And so using that combination seems to be the combination that's working the best at this point. Up until now, remdesivir has been shown to cut down the days that you were sick, but not necessarily the risk of dying. However, this new finding from Gilead Sciences says that it looks like it's reducing your risk of dying as well. This still needs to be followed by other studies and peer-reviewed to make sure that this is accurate, but that's the information we're getting right now. So that's remdesivir. And then the third one I want to talk about is back to school. There's been a lot of controversy about back to school and what that means. Should kids go back to school? Of interest, I have been talking to experts over the last couple of days for a story we're doing on NBC News about back to school. All experts I talked to, and it's about 6 experts, asked them the same question. Would you send your child back to school? Universally, all of them, yes, without hesitation, they would send their kids back to school. The American Academy of Pediatrics would send their kids back. They are saying emphatically that kids do need to go back to school. And school systems are lining up and saying we need to get kids back to school as well. But everyone is doing it with caveats. The experts I talked to, American Academy of Pediatrics, school systems, other health experts, are all saying we do need to get kids back to school, but we need to make sure we do it in a very safe manner. And that means making sure they social distance, making sure they wear masks if they can't social distance, and thinking outside the box what they can do while they're in school to minimize their chances of getting it. Now, we do know that children don't get it as often, don't get coronavirus as often. They don't have consequences from coronavirus the same rates that adults do, and they don't seem to spread it as often. But that doesn't mean they won't get it, they won't have consequences, or they won't spread it. So we need to be extra careful there. So again, the bottom line from all these experts is kids do need to go back to school for social development, for educational development, even for nutritional development in some cases, especially students that come from families that can't afford to feed them the 3 meals a day, especially healthy meals, or people that are in food deserts. They need to get back to school as well, but with the understanding they need to do this very safely. So when you hear people talking about they need to go back 5 days a week, all day long, entire classrooms, that is not what anybody's talking about of expert opinions. They're saying we need to get them back in creative fashions. It might be a hybrid system set up where some go one day, some go another day. Gym classes are outside instead of inside, if they're at all. Lunch in the classroom, desks separated, maybe with plexiglass partitions in between. Just different things we can do to make sure those kids are taken care of. The other thing of interest note is talking about wearing masks. What the American Academy of Pediatrics says is if they can separate their desks by 6 feet, that's the best. They can cut down to 3 feet, but that means they have to wear masks while they're sitting 3 feet apart. Older kids, this works great. Some of the experts I talked to, they said they're concerned about particularly elementary school kids. A couple reasons. One, sharing the masks, taking their masks off. It's hard to keep an elementary school kid in the mask all day long. Plus, they found out anecdotally, these kids tend to share their masks. Yours looks cooler than mine. Let's switch masks, which is the absolute worst thing to do, because if I have it and don't know, you take my mask, guess what? Then you're going to get it because you're breathing that virus in. So again, back to school come in the fall. From the experts I've talked to, the American Academy of Pediatrics, they're saying kids do need to go back to school in the fall for a variety of reasons. They just need to make sure they do that safely. And that's what a lot of systems are trying to figure out right now, how to do that safely. We'll know more in the next few weeks what kind of solutions they're coming up with, but it looks like they're going to come up with solutions to get them back to school. And then, again, we'll get them in the school system, we'll keep them safe, and we'll keep the rest of us safe as well. So let me see if you have any questions now.
I've seen reports of children dying. Why are people saying that this doesn't affect kids? They're terrible at social distancing.
So the question is, the question is that they've seen reports of kids dying. So why are people, myself including, saying it doesn't affect kids? What I'm saying is it doesn't affect kids as much as it affects adults. It doesn't affect kids neither from them catching it. They don't seem to be able to catch it as much as adults do, and studies have shown that. They don't seem to have consequences from it, the serious consequences that adults do as well, and they don't seem to spread it either. Part of that has to do with their immune system, the way their immune system's set up versus our immune system. Part of it has to do with their body system. There's a thing called an ACE2 receptor. That ACE2 receptor is what we think coronaviruses latches onto. Kids don't have those developed to the level that adults do, so I think that might be one of the reasons. Again, these are all just things that people are postulating at this point. But we do know that one of the things was this MIS-C syndrome that came out, the multisystem inflammatory syndrome in children that came out, and it was making the news about a month ago with children dying from this, a few children, and around 300 people that got sick from it. They got very, very sick. They were in the hospital. They were on ventilators. Majority of these children have survived, and it was 300 children around the world that we've been reported on so far. That is a very, very small number. So this is, as all the experts say, this is a very rare incidence of a disease in children. And so this is not something that happens to all children. But it does highlight the fact that children, even though we know they're somewhat protected from this, they don't seem to catch it as much, they don't seem to have consequences from it, and they don't seem to spread it as much. That doesn't mean they won't catch it. That doesn't mean they won't have serious consequences, and that doesn't mean they won't spread it. It just means they're less likely to. And then you have to look at the risk-benefit of, okay, if we get them back to school, what's the benefit of that versus the risk of something like this happening, which is very, very low. And so looking at that, again, most experts are on the side of the benefit of them going back to school certainly outweighs the rare risk of something like this happening, especially across the nation.
You know, we talk about children going back to school, but what about teachers and support staff, the adults that are in those at-risk categories?
And so the question is, and this is a very good question, we talk about the children going back to school and the fact that they don't catch it as much, they don't have the consequences, they don't spread it as much. But what about their teachers? What about other staff in the school? And even what about their home life, if they take something home with them, especially if they live with at-risk groups, especially if they live with grandparents that are elderly, if they live with other relatives who have health issues, this might be a concern. And that is a huge concern. That's why one of the components, again, remember, I say getting them back to school is important, but it's equally important to get them back to school safely. And that doesn't mean just safe for them, safe for the teacher, safe for the staff, safe for their home environment. And that's going to require testing. That's going to require constant observation of what's going on, contact tracing if somebody does become sick. This is not a simple let them walk in the door at the beginning of the day and walk out at the end of the day. There's going to be a lot of moving parts going on here to try and keep them and everybody else safe around them. But again, this can be done. As Dr. Fauci said, it needs to be done creatively, and they're starting to think of those creative solutions right now.
Do schools need updated ventilation systems to comply?
And the question is, do schools need updated ventilation systems to comply? And I commend everybody here. You're having great questions today, and this is actually a wonderful question as well, because early on I talked about the airborne transmission possibilities of this virus, which we think there might be a small component to that. But we also know that you're more likely to catch it indoors than outdoors. Part of that reason is because of the ventilation system. If you think especially our newer buildings are not set up to have outside ventilation. They're eco-friendly buildings, and so they're mostly set up to keep the cooling and heating controlled and more easily accessible. And so you can't necessarily open a window and get that airflow through there. And so they're going to have to look at that as well. And a lot of school systems are saying, hey, we're not going to open until we get that ventilation system. We get filtration in there. We get a way to transfer the outside air inside and the inside air outside, so we can make sure we get this virus filtered out if it is there and it's not as easily caught. But again, that's a fantastic question. Ventilation systems definitely need to be looked into before we get these kids back into school. And it might be, especially in the fall when things first start off, as they're trying to get this worked out, that some of the school takes place outdoors, maybe a tent that has the flaps open and they're outside or under a canopy of some sort, so that way they get that outdoor ventilation. Again, a lot of creative thinking is going on behind this, so time will tell what they come up with.
Is 3 feet safe for an elementary school? We're talking about 6 feet all the time.
So 6 feet is what is recommended. 6 feet social distancing because of those respiratory droplets. And what they said is 3 feet if they wear masks. And so for elementary school, that's going to be a little tougher because elementary school students are less likely to keep it on, and they're more likely to share masks, which is one of the worst case scenarios there. Some other things they're talking about, besides possibly that 3 foot distance, is facing all the chairs forward. If you think about the old schoolrooms, like when I went to school, we all faced forward in rows. Doing the same thing right now, instead of having groups or pods of students that are facing each other. Great up until now for collaboration and the development, but at this point, safety first is keeping that maybe possibly lined up so nobody's breathing directly on anybody else. But again, they're saying that 3 foot distance with the caveat that they have to wear masks while they're within that 3 foot distance, or within that 6 foot distance.
Am I safe in my convertible car?
So the question is, am I safe in my convertible car? Overall answer is yes, you are safe. And I get the similar questions about, am I safe bicycling with somebody? Am I safe if I'm running outdoors? Outside, this virus does not spread nearly as much as it does inside. And part of that's because of ventilation. Plus, if you think about it, if you're in your convertible car, well, number one, if you're moving, very unlikely you're going to get it just because of airflow patterns and how fast you're going. If you're standing still, you're 6 feet away from somebody else. Now, if you're in a car with somebody, even if it's a convertible, you have to make sure that they're either family members, somebody you live with that you know has been safe and you've been safe, or everybody has masks on. and that's just the name of the game at this point. But the convertible itself should not be an issue, especially if you're out and about and driving.
Can you get permanent damage from COVID-19?
So the question is, can you get permanent damage from COVID-19? At this point, we're not sure because we've only been talking about this for a little over 4 months, but we think you can, and particularly in a couple different areas. One are the lung issues that are going on. This, if you remember, it started off as a strange pneumonia out of China. That strange pneumonia developed into these people have coronavirus, and then we ended up with a pandemic. So it does affect the lungs, and it could cause lung damage that we think will be permanent. On top of that, it can also cause neurological damage. This seems to really affect the brain. If you think about one of the main symptoms is the lack of smell, lack of taste. The reason that happens is because the virus gets up into the upper part of the nose where you have your smell receptors. Those are nerve endings. It gets into those nerves and causes them to go numb, which means that you then can't smell. If you can't smell, then you can't taste. Well, that is a nerve, so it's getting into your neurological system, can get into your brain as well, and it can cause a condition called encephalitis. That encephalitis, even though it doesn't happen to everybody, it's less rare than some of the other complications, is still a neurological complication that can be lifelong. On top of that, the third thing, we do now know that coronavirus, for some reason, causes blood clots. Those blood clots can cause issues, and we've seen patients with amputations, we've seen patients with other clotting type issues, strokes included. Those could be lifelong as well. So understand this, coronavirus is a dangerous virus, and it's one of those things that doesn't affect everybody the same way, but for those it does affect, especially if it affects severely, they can have lifelong implications because of that. So again, thank you very much. This has been wonderful questions you guys have today. Thank you for those. But the headlines we talked about, the airborne transmission, World Health Organization is now saying there is a possibility of that. Other experts, including Dr. Fauci, is saying we don't have any hard evidence, but it certainly is a possibility that could be happening. But what we do know is it spreads easier indoors than outdoors. So if you have to err on one side, err for the outdoors. Remdessevir is the second headline we talked about, a drug that's out there that, according to Gilead Sciences, who developed remdesivir, their own findings are showing that it can cut down on the death rate. Other studies will come along to verify that. But if that's true, then we now have 2 drugs that can cut down on the death rate, remdesivir and dexamethasone, a steroid. And then the third one was back to school. It's turned into a bit of a controversial issue, but most experts are saying, all experts I have talked to, health experts, are saying, let's get them back to school. They need to get back to school, but, and this is the big caveat, we need to make sure we do that safely. Safely for them, safely for the teachers and the staff, safely for their home environment as well, which means, of course, safe for the entire community. So thank you very much. Hope you have a fantastic weekend. And above all, stay happy and stay healthy.